Warning. This episode contains strong language and optimism about the future, which may be inappropriate for some listeners. What if I told you that our democracy isn't truly democratic? That the ancient Greeks, who we credit for supposedly developing the system, wouldn't recognize what we have today as a democracy at all? Today, with the help of my guest, Matthew Gray of Renton Technical College, we're going to diagnose the failings of our democracy and propose a radical solution, ancient Athens style, that just might cure many of our political ills in the United States. And we'll dig into the math, computer science, and growing social movement behind making it happen. This is Solarpunk Now, a podcast about politics, science, technology, philosophy, and whatever else it'll take to get us out of this mess. Join us, and let's demand a brighter future together.
It is accepted as democratic when public offices are allocated by lot and as oligarchic when they are filled by election.
That's a quote from Aristotle's Politics. In the ancient Athens of his time, a device called a clariterion was used to select many of their governing officials. Much in the same way that we randomly select juries today, magistrates were chosen at random from among the pool of eligible freemen in the city. The idea was to prevent oligarchs from paying their way into these positions, using their money to influence the outcomes of elections. Now, to be fair, Aristotle wasn't the biggest fan of democracy, nor were most of our well-known political theorists, who feared that letting the uneducated masses make decisions would lead to mob rule and chaos, thus providing an opportunity for a tyrant to seize control. In fact, according to anthropologist and democracy advocate David Graeber, the word democracy was, up until recently, used as an insult or sort of boogeyman among Western political and economic elites. Democracy, the rule of the demos, the people, however defined, was seen as a threat to institutionalized wealth and power. And a true democracy, where the people actually decide for themselves, rather than their participation being limited to electing so-called representatives, still carries an air of danger for today's rich and powerful. But around the mid-1800s, something shifted. As Graeber notes, American and French politicians began to openly identify as Democrats, essentially as a marketing gimmick.
Andrew Jackson was the first presidential candidate to present himself as a Democrat, a label by which he meant that he would defend the interests of the little people against the powerful. It was basically a cynical ploy, but it was wildly successful. So much that within 10 years' time, all candidates of all political parties were referring to themselves as Democrats. The elaborate Republican system that the founders had created with the express purpose of containing the dangers of democracy itself was relabeled democracy, which is how we continue to use the term today.
That's an excerpt from Graeber's History of Democracy in his book, The Democracy Project. He demonstrates how our contemporary American sense of democracy is a far cry from the classical definition of the term, and argues that there's no clear lineage from ancient Greek to 21st century American democracy. Instead, we have a system of institutionalized bribery where the market and its biggest players determine our policy. Legal scholar and political theorist Wendy Brown argues that a functioning democracy doesn't require absolute economic equality, but that the people must be close enough to equal that we can at least deliberate on common ground.
Democracy cannot withstand large and fixed extremes of wealth and poverty. When such extremes prevail, shared values vanish, and class powers and resentments become decisive. Precisely such extremes have been generated in the United States over the past 30 years.
Brown argues that neoliberalism, a governing rationality marked by austerity, deregulation, and the devaluing of political education and participation, has hollowed out our democracy.
The evisceration of robust norms of democracy is accompanied by unprecedented challenges to democratization, including complex forms and novel concentrations of economic and political power, sophisticated marketing and theatricality in politics, corporately owned media, and a historically unparalleled glut of information and opinion that produces an illusion of knowledge, freedom, and even participation in the face of their opposites.
So here we are, left with a twisted, hollowed-out version of democracy in an increasingly unequal society. I think it's high time we tried something new. My guest today is Matthew Gray, an adjunct faculty at Renton Technical College and an independent researcher. He's interested in math with applications in computer science, from optimizing data structures to quantum cryptography, and, most relevant for our conversation, secure multi-party computation. He's also interested in more humanities and social science areas like history. Matthew is particularly concerned about the rise of anti-democratic politics, and with finding ways to strengthen democracy and bring its practice closer to its ideal, of the people, by the people, for the people. The work he's doing at the intersection of computer science and social science is what I want to discuss in this episode. Here's Matthew on how he first got interested in studying history, and where that interest led him.
It might be that I've always been interested. I remember in like 3rd or 4th grade doing a presentation on the Mongols for like my class. And sort of initially a lot of my interest in history was more like war and sort of battles and sort of like what I semi-jokingly refer to as dude bro history, sort of the people who would show up for the history, like would show up for Civil War reenactments or World War II things.
That paints a picture.
But anything deeper than that, into like in like the history of like indigenous political structures, or the history of like different social movements, or like history of food, or anything outside of like white guys with guns being uninteresting. And I think to some degree that's where I probably started off. The first history book I read was a biography of Julius Caesar, which was a lot of fun, but sort of over time sort of branched out into trying to understand the world better, trying to understand how we got where we are. And it's a lot of fun, and it's really strange and bizarre, like sitting up and looking around and seeing all of the imprints of history on the world around us, and sort of getting a sense for both the ways like that the world that we live in right now is sort of born of these periods, echoes these periods, and also is in many ways its own thing. I think all of that can be both really fun and really useful.
Do you feel like there's a tension between computer science and more humanities, social science-oriented fields like history?
I would say if there is a tension, it's just in like you literally only have so much time in your life, and both like you know, there is an infinite amount of history and an infinite amount of computer science.
Yeah. And a finite amount of Matthew.
And a finite amount of Matthew. And so that's I would say that's the only place where there's real tension. I'd say that there can be a lot of symmetry. Both of them are very concerned with process, and modeling, and in some ways storytelling. And I think it's possible that my interest in computer science and mathematics draws me to understandings of history and understandings of politics that might be a little too formulaic, and I try and sometimes like balance that with like a remembering that, you know, underneath it all it's people, and people are a fucking mess.
There's that saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And maybe a view of history that's too formulaic risks missing what's unique or particular about the time that we're in.
Like the current world that we live in right now, has some deep parallels to the 15th, 16th century sort of aftermath of the printing press and this brand new information technology that fucked everything up, like in ways both like beautiful and horrifying. I mean, it gave us increasing literacy. It also gave us the Reformation, which, either thumbs up or thumbs down, depending how you feel about the Catholic Church. And it gave us the 30 Years' War and the wars of religion in Europe. I think it can be both we've managed to deal with our new information technology so far in a not horrifying way, but also it took a while to get to the 30 Years' War from Gutenberg. So maybe we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back so hard. And sort of an awareness that the stakes can be really, really high. I mean, the 30 Years' War, in terms of death and destruction per capita, was worse than World War I, which was, goddamn horrifying. So anyway, I think it's sort of that those two areas of interest can synergize in fun ways.
Yeah. So, speaking of people being messy, what are your thoughts on our current political system, specifically the way that our elected officials campaign and we vote for them?
Short answer is I don't like it. Long answer is almost everybody agrees that politicians are awful.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody has any solutions for that problem, except for right now, like across the world, there's been a bit of and by a bit I mean a lot of a drift towards authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Where at least, instead of having 1 million politicians, you only have one. And I really don't like that option either.
Yeah. And it seems like we sort of just accept that there's this class of people who are just corrupt and it's a tight in-group and they have their own weird
rituals and culture.
Yeah.
And they that being a democracy means tolerating and being led by and listening to the lies of this group of people. A group of people that has become increasingly unrepresentative of Americans in general. The median net wealth in the House of Representatives is $1 million. The median wealth in the Senate, I was trying to find those numbers right before hopping on here. I think it's 5 million, but it's a little bit hard to nail down exactly. And so that means more than half of Congress people of both parties are millionaires, and that's not representative of the American people. And we can sort of go into all the other ways in which they're not representative of the American people. They're disproportionately Ivy League lawyers and business people. And there's I think maybe 3 or 4 scientists or engineers in Congress, and 2 or 3 teachers. I think there might be 1 or 2 professors. No truck drivers. No no primary, middle, high school teachers. Despite the fact that
Amazon warehouse workers.
No Amazon warehouse workers. No, very few nurses. Very few. It's people who paid lots of money to go to fancy. There's a fair number of doctors, interestingly, but it's people who were able to pay for medical school or Ivy League training and then law school, and have millions of dollars in the bank. And I don't think they do a good job of representing us, especially because they have very little time to represent us. Most of their time is spent raising money for the next campaign. And even when they are representing us, it doesn't feel like they're none of them are thinking, what would Matthew like? What would make Matthew a happy boy? What they're thinking is, how do I keep Matthew from voting against me in the next election? How do I keep Matthew from hating me more than the other people?
Yeah, their goal isn't to serve the needs of their constituents so much as sway their opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not fun. Um and it's at least hypothetically open. Like it's definitely better than feudalism. I'd take our current system over feudalism any day.
Well, that's not exactly a glowing review of the American political system. But I think that's how a lot of people feel about our current political economic climate. It's not the greatest, but it could be worse. In the same way we might feel capitalist realism about our economy, that pervasive and pessimistic sense that there is no alternative, we have a sort of electoral realism about our political system. We just accept that this is how it has to work. But, I mean, he's right. It is better than feudalism, and it's not the most corrupt or anti-democratic political system out there today.
Real quick, then, the things that I do like about our current system is elected officials do have to at least spend some of their time serving the needs of the people. Because ultimately, if the people collectively decide that they fucking hate the politician, that politician will be out of a job. That means that they can't be the sort of completely high-handed, murderous, bastards that dictators, kings, and other, non-democrats are. And that, in democracies, a lot of the time, year over year, life gets better for people. And it's in the interests of the government to make that happen because, if people's lives get better, they produce more tax revenue. They produce more economic value, which can be captured as tax revenue, and good times. And so it's in the interest of democratic leaders to make life better for their citizens. But it's definitely not their top priority, and I would prefer that was not the case. The top priority is, how do I duck and weave and shake the right hands and say the right things on television to get elected next time around?
Yeah. So, ideally, a voting system represents the collective will of the people. It's, we've decided that this person is going to act in our best interest over any other candidate. But what that means in practice is that there's a system that people are trying to game.
100%. And it's a very gameable system.
Especially considering how limited our time and energy is for researching the candidates and the issues. And, especially with this new internet technology that we don't totally understand the implications of, we can't, there's a question of how much we can even trust the information we're being presented about said candidates.
Yeah.
So what's the answer here? The structural incentives in our political system currently invite bribery and other sorts of corruption. But is there a better way to do things? For Matthew, the answer is sortition.
The basic idea probably has roots older than we know about. But the first recorded instance I know of was as one of the foundational pillars of the Athenian democracy after the removal of the tyrants. So in your civics class or government class that you maybe took in high school, because maybe it was required, but maybe not, you probably were introduced to the idea of the citizens' assembly in Athens, which was sort of the direct democracy of everybody in the town, in the city, and outlying regions comes together. And of course, when I say everybody, I mean the non-slave men, all the free men. And there were a lot of slaves in Athens. The free men would all get together in a room and or in a space and argue and debate and make decisions for the state. But that was only one half of the Athenian constitutional model. The other main part was the Athenians' citizens' court, which carried out most of the executive functions of the city. They would have panels on different parts of civic life. You'd have people doing water, like sanitation, military stuff, whatever. And these people would be selected at random.
This is where the Kleroterion comes in. That was the way that ancient Athenians would essentially pull names out of a hat, which in their case contained the names of all of the freemen in the city.
And this was seen as a really, really, really essential piece of the system. It served as sort of a big hedge and a big force against tyranny. Because sort of in a pure democracy, there was, I think, the fear that, as in our elected system, charismatic, rich, powerful people could buy or sway the votes of the people and lead people off into crazy town and reestablish a tyranny. But if you had executive power sort of distributed amongst this group, like maybe you can bribe all of the people. They swore oaths not to. But again, like it served as both a way to sort of like calm the passions, keep sort of factions from forming, to keep sort of particularly powerful people from taking control. In the modern context, this is really, really appealing for a lot of reasons. Number one is the question of representation. Right now, again, as we've talked about, median wealth in Congress is $1 million. That is not representative. The racial breakdown is not representative. The age breakdown is not representative. If you pulled names out of a hat, it would be representative.
This sounds great in theory, but we couldn't just pull up a Kleroterion from the ruins of ancient Athens and start using it in America today. Making the system secure, trustworthy, and scalable will require a lot of math. It sounds like there are two things to consider with the sortition model. You aren't just putting all of the names of Americans into a hat and pulling them out. There's also a way that you sort of balance it to make sure it's still representative. So
there's been work done looking at that. There's a group of researchers at CMU who have now, the professor sort of leading the group has moved to Harvard. And they've published like, I think 3 papers now, looking at how to do that in mathematically pleasing ways, how to sort of balance, the main issue that they're looking at is, how do you counteract selection bias or self-selection bias?
Basically, there might be some people more willing to volunteer their names for the hat in the first place. Maybe the selection pool then winds up disproportionately favoring white, male, educated Ivy League lawyers. And that's hardly representative of the population as a whole, so the model needs a way to account for this self-selection bias.
And this turns out to be a really, 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 really interesting mathematical problem. Like, they were able to get 3 papers out of it already, and I think there's still ongoing work.
Sounds like this issue of representation and quotas is more where the focus of the research is than getting a random list of people.
Yes.
Like, the randomized list seems pretty straightforward.
Kind of.
Okay.
So the area that I've been focusing on and doing my research into is looking at how do you go about choosing a random number in a way that everybody can be confident is random.
Okay, because that was a big advantage of the ancient Athenian system, is that it was publicly verifiable. So, everybody gets together in the town square and they see how the random number is generated.
Yeah. And the way that was done, we think, is some sort of mechanical system involving dice. I think that that's good, but I don't trust it because dice can be weighted and coins can be weighted and all of these things can be messed with. And if you have sort of any randomness creating machine is visually indistinguishable from a randomness faking machine. Like, at the very least, I've been thinking about this for a couple months now, and I haven't been able to think of anything that you can just look at and be confident, like that's a mechanical process that you can just look at and be confident hasn't been messed with. So I have been worried about that, and what I've been looking into is how do we go about generating randomness in a way that computationally everyone can be confident is random. And this happens to be a very interesting problem.
There are everyday situations where you could imagine generating a random number that everyone can agree on. Like, maybe you're rolling dice with your friends to see who goes first in a board game. In small settings like that, where everyone has established relationships, the trustworthiness of the selection method doesn't matter so much. But getting the entire American electorate to agree on the result of a random selection process? That's a whole other thing. And it's where this area of research comes in.
So the result that initiated this field was the 1986 impossibility result by Cleve. And so what he proved is something kind of unfortunate, which is within sort of the model that we would most like randomness to be able to be like generated in a way everybody can be confident in, it can't.
The way we'd like to be able to generate a random number is just to have some people send inputs to each other. These inputs would be arbitrarily chosen by each participant. Maybe some people flip a coin, some people roll dice, whatever. What matters is that these inputs are produced independently, so there's no way for anyone to know what other participants' inputs are. The resulting output, our random number, is then calculated from all the inputs. This is done in such a way that any particular input can completely change the output.
Everybody writes down a number between 0 and the number of people who are options, -1.
Okay.
Alternately, everybody writes down a number between 1 and the number of options. And then you take that number, all of the numbers that people have put in, you add them all together, you divide by the number of options and take the remainder. And so that remainder is guaranteed to be somewhere between 1 and the number of people, or number of options.
And as long as at least one participant in the process isn't influenced in their choice by any others, the result is truly random.
Yeah.
That's really elegant.
Yeah. Isn't that great? And that's something that you can, like, I can explain over this phone call, and, like, the proofs for this are a little bit more complicated. But again, like, this is something that you could explain to high schoolers.
Without getting too deep into the math, basically there are two ways this ideal model can go wrong when you put it into practice. First, someone might cheat by peeking at the already submitted inputs before submitting theirs. Secondly, they might abort the procedure, choosing not to submit their answer after all. To make this random number generation model work in practice, our system needs to prevent participants from aborting before the results are calculated. It also needs to keep all the inputs hidden until they're revealed simultaneously, which requires a shared awareness of time.
And sort of these two things, like a lack of awareness of time and a freedom to abort, are the two things that make it impossible to generate randomness without a majority of people being honest. And what we would really love to do is have a system in which you know that you're honest. And so you know that the randomness was truly random. So you need to do one of two different things. You either need to have an awareness of time, or you need to be able to stop people from aborting. Which again is sort of like not revealing their input, not proceeding with the sort of communication to the end. And so these sort of are two different sort of ways of looking at this. There was a paper that came out last year in 2020 on non-malleable time lock puzzles, which we're not going to explain what any of those words mean.
Okay.
But basically what they are a cryptographic tool that, among other things, allow you to get what we want. Where we like, if you're honest, you can be confident that the result is honest, is good and truly random. The downside is the way that this works basically is everybody takes their input and then sort of puts it inside of this thing called a time lock puzzle, which takes a while for you to open up. Computationally takes a lot of time. And so for what this does is it keeps people from aborting, because even if they do abort, they don't open it, we can just spend 10 hours or whatever of computer time to bust open their commitment. And so that gets around this problem in ways that are super, super awesome. The main downside of that approach is similar to my main beef with Bitcoin, which is, to get the kinds of results that Bitcoin wants, you have to invest potentially huge quantities of electricity and computer time. And it can have a significant negative environmental impact. And I'd be super into this as an approach if, we had a fully sustainable grid and could afford to, do all of this with no downside. But I feel a little bit uncomfortable recommending that as the way to do this. Might be worth it. But also the other big downside is that this requires, for people to be confident and comfortable with this as a system, requires so much goddamn math. This is not math that you can there are some crypto systems which you can explain in a week to high schoolers and they will understand. Algebra is enough. We're going to introduce a handful of new ideas. We're going to introduce these protocols. Come in for a week of math class, and we can teach you how some of these systems work. And then there are crypto systems that require a PhD to understand. And this is more along the lines of one of those.
So, well, it might be possible to get an expert to trust this system if you tell it to the sort of person who might get randomly pulled from a hat. They're very unlikely to understand it, and that interferes with this process of trust.
Yeah, because ultimately, you want to be able to trust that whoever's pulling names out of the hat isn't looking. And yeah, if getting to that place where you trust that they're not looking requires you to have years of mathematical training,
that's not very democratic.
Not very democratic. Yeah. I'm I'd enjoy if everybody got years of mathematical training, but I don't think they would, and therefore I don't want them to have to do that. That seems like a bad time.
Yeah. So we're at a point where there is a way to implement sortition, but it's not ideal for a lot of reasons.
Well, that's one approach.
Okay.
So again, the original impossibility result said you either need to be aware of time or you need to be able to keep people from aborting. And so the other approach is to look at how can we keep people from aborting. The most obvious way of doing this is to do this in person and to have your commits basically be physical seals. So if, for instance, you and your friends or you and your local town wanted to do this, what you could do is you could get everybody into a room, or if it's a larger town, the local sports stadium together, and everybody could bring in a envelope with their sort of their sort of contribution to the randomness inside. And then what you could do, as one example, is have each of these envelopes have a little magnet inside, and then take all of these and put them on a big piece of metal in the middle of the thing, and then set all of the envelopes on fire. It's a very dramatic and extra way of carrying this out.
Wow.
You could also just have them all be opened up in the middle, but this means that nobody's able to adjust their input based on what other people's inputs are. And nobody can be like, plot twist, I don't want to show you what I wrote down after learning something about your input. And so what this gives you unconditional, like, perfect confidence in this. As long as your contribution was random, like you flipped coins at home and then wrote down what the results were or rolled dice, you can be, and you're confident that nobody saw your thing before the envelope was burned away, you can be 100% confident that this is truly random. And it seems like the most likely way that you can scale this up is to basically have a tournament style, where you get people together in person and you select, okay, which of us is going up to the next round? And then those people meet up and do another round of this. And then they find out which of those people is going up to the next round. And that way you're able to do, like, sort of every round that you add allows you to exponentially scale out the number of people who can participate. And so that would be a way of sort of using the reason that you can't abort is because you're there in person and you put the thing on the board. Like you sealed it in some sort of physical container and then put it in sort of a central location that everybody can observe, and there's no way to pull things out or change things once they're there. So that's sort of the way to use that math, that approach. And it also makes it a lot more fun, personal opinion.
Like if we stop having our campaigns and our polling and voting, we still need to have some kind of ceremony.
Totally.
And it might as well involve fire.
Totally. Yeah, and so, like, this is a way of, like, everybody who's interested in participating gets to come together and have a party, and then we pick, we pick who gets to go to the next party, and then sort of on until you sort of have your congressperson.
So, sort of like what we do now with primaries and campaigning in different states, but more representative of...
Better in every way.
Yeah.
I mean, you as a person have a chance of, going to Congress under this model in a much more real way than I feel about myself or I feel about anyone I know.
Yeah. And it starts with going to this great local event in your community.
Yeah.
Big ceremony and
meeting, a bunch of people who are interested in serving the public. Yeah.
That could be a great forum for debate too. Even if people don't
totally
make it to the next round, you're still gathering people together who are interested in serving their communities.
And sort of like, those people can then, after the selection has taken place, like, can have a conversation with their new representative or new potential representative. So yeah, those are sort of the two broad approaches. And something like the time lock puzzles might be a better idea during a pandemic when gathering people together is a bad idea. But in, non-pandemic times, or even in, the like pandemic light that we're in right now, I think doing the in-person selections is a really, really, really cool and fun and good idea. If we want one last little sort of funny version of this, if you've ever been in a big crowd of people, like one way to think about like the tournament style thing, is even if you have like a ton of people, like the whole population of California, and we're picking the senators, it's only going to take about like let's say there's 5 million people in California. 40 million people.
It's a lot. It's very many.
Yeah. Let's imagine that we picked the senator for California by a rock, paper, scissors tournament.
Oh, I'd kick ass.
How long would this tournament take? Well, it would take some time. But sort of the way that like this mathematically works out is like, okay, every time you do a round, every time, like after everybody has done their first round of rock, paper, scissors, you've halved the number of people. And then, after you do another round, you have the number of people again. And so you have an exponential decay in the number of people. And so basically what you have is like every 3 rounds or so, you're down to an eighth. After 10 rounds, you're down to a 1,000th. After, I guess that would be 30 rounds, you're down to a 1,000,000th, and so you're down to like 40 people. And then it's like 4 or 5 more rounds. And so, you know, you'd have to be bussing people around because eventually you're the only person who like in all of LA who hasn't lost at rock, paper, scissors yet. But at the end, like, you know, if you're able to make sure that everybody is only like participating, like you don't move on to the next rounds of rock, paper, scissoring until everybody has done their rounds. This is only going to take you like maybe 5 days to select a senator, and that's with rock, paper, scissors. The fall off for like a tournament that selects, like, each round selects like between like 100 people or 1,000 people, that sort of fall off is going to be much quicker.
So that's a general overview of the math for making modern sortition work. Making a large-scale system like this both trustworthy and secure is no easy task. But there are ways it can be done, and it's really promising to see that the research has come this far, even without the mainstream interest or institutional support it would have if this became a widely used method of selecting representatives. And anyway, there are groups doing sortition right now. The problem that Matthew and others are working on is how to secure this system in an environment where people can't or don't trust each other, and where the stakes are very high. But in a smaller group, like, say, a nonprofit or a high school student government, that level of mathematical security isn't quite so important. There are organizations out there already doing sortition, and the idea is available to any group who wants to try implementing it, or even developing it further. The spectacle of American electoral politics may tend to distract us from other possibilities, but they are out there right now.
So those groups are looking into and sort of using the tools for making things more representative. As of yet, none of them are using the tools to make this secure. Basically, because there's no stakes. Like none of the groups that are currently engaging in sortition, like the most politically consequential sortition assembly that has been put together was an Irish body that was pulled together as an advisory committee to their parliament on a bunch of different issues. And the thing that they're most known for is they recommended that the referendum on abortion policy in Ireland be carried out, and they recommended it on by a very large margin. It was over 2/3. Previously, abortion had been pretty illegal in Ireland, and so you had people like taking boats over to England to do that, and people who couldn't afford to do that not being able to do that. And they decided to they didn't, the advisory body did not say we should have abortion be legalized, but what they said was we should have a referendum to let the people decide on this, which kind of spurred the parliament / maybe gave the parliament political cover. I don't really know what the internal politics of that was. Spurred them to actually carry out that referendum, which carried in favor of legalizing abortion in the country. So that's the most consequential one of these, was an advisory board for a variety of issues. And, that's quite impactful, but it's not the sort of thing that I'd be surprised if there was a concentrated sabotage campaign trying to influence the selection of those people. They definitely didn't know, I don't think they knew ahead of time, what things they would be bringing up to this group. But although they might have, and I don't know, I don't think any anti-abortion groups were sufficiently on it to, try and sabotage this.
Yeah. As the stakes get higher, you have to secure the system against all sorts of manipulation and corruption.
Yeah. I mean, we've already seen, and there's a very long history of Russian security services trying to influence American elections. Nikita Khrushchev tried to help get JFK elected. So Like there's a long history of that, and we would like, if possible, to create. That's another upside, actually, of this system, is it's significantly harder, actually, for the Russians to to influence elections than than influence elections.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to consider as we're looking at all the ways this needs to be secured to be truly random and truly verifiable and all these things. Our current system doesn't meet those standards. Not even close.
No, not even close.
That brings me to where I want to go next as we're finishing this conversation up. I want to talk more about the potential implications of sortition were it to actually be implemented, because, you know, there are these mathematical issues to work out, but we need to keep perspective in mind here that, like, this is still a better system in a lot of ways.
Yeah, in kind of every way. I definitely, ever since, like, coming across this idea, I've sort of looked out at the world and been like, almost every problem I'm really upset about would be solved or solvable with this as the system.
So what sort of problems do you have in mind when you're saying that?
The rise in political violence that we're seeing in the US, in US politics. After January 6th, it's now basically been established that large-scale political violence is a legitimate tactic within our system. Like the politicians who encouraged that and pushed that to happen have faced no real meaningful consequences. Which, if a political tactic is if there are no negative consequences for using a political tactic, it is now a legitimate political tactic, and that terrifies me. And a lot of what that is driven by is hyperpartisanship and hyperpolarization, which just doesn't exist in a sortition environment, because there's the hyperpartisanship that we see is driven by partisan news media and political parties that don't they exist the reason that a political party has power is because they help people get elected.
Right.
They are a parasite off of the electoral system.
They're the organizations that help the politicians game the system, the voting system.
100%. And so minus the electoral system, there's no reason for political parties. They're just a tool for gaming the system. You would probably see something where there's something similar to the caucuses that we have right now if we had a sortitionally selected Congress, where it's people who have shared interests or shared beliefs or shared demographics. But you wouldn't have political parties. There's just no need. And so you would get to a place where number one, you don't have these systems that are driving polarization for political advantage and for electoral advantage. You also would allow people to have groups of opinions and express those politically that currently don't exist. Right now, you have to either be pro-gun, anti-abortion, and believe that climate change is a hoax, or at least that's politically, you express that set of beliefs. Or you have to express the set of political beliefs of, we should have more gun laws, climate change is real and a problem, we need to do stuff about it, and everybody should be able to have abortions. And there's no, there might be underlying reasons why all of those opinions go together, and they still might track together, but you can imagine situations where people get to have much more complicated opinions.
Yeah, they don't all have to be grouped together under the brand of their affiliated party.
Political orthodox. Yeah. And so one of the effects of that is that issues on which the majority of Americans agree, like climate change is real and we should be doing something about it, that gets to be expressed. That's something that a supermajority of Americans agree on. And that's something that the current system, in large part because politicians need money to get elected, and people with money are typically wedded to the current economic system, which runs on benefits and profits from fossil fuels. Like,
yeah. So that's the next thing I want to get to.
yeah,
Let's talk about money in politics right now.
yeah, like we have bribery. We have a bribery based political system with a wink and a nudge and a little bit of like gauze around it. And it's not like, maybe that's a little strong. Maybe there's other things that happen besides the bribery, but the bribery is a massive part of the system that we exist in right now. You don't have people showing up at Congress people's doors with, briefcases of money, but you have, people get like the most common job for congressmen after they retire is political lobbying.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's the most common profession.
Well, who would know how to lobby better than ex-politicians?
Exactly. And that gives a really direct way for, the lobbyists to reward the politicians once they leave. Like Congressman X, who spent a lot of time talking to oil lobbyists, has a very good chance of being hired as an oil lobbyist. Politician Y, who spent a lot of time with pharmaceutical lobbyists, has a very good chance of being hired as a pharmaceutical lobbyist, especially if they, let the pharmaceutical companies or oil companies or financial companies write the laws that they were, putting forth to Congress, which not infrequently they do.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In a way, what it's doing is ossifying the existing hierarchies and inequalities.
You get your hands on a big chunk of money and power, and then anything that could come along to threaten that, market disruption, climate change, saying maybe have less oil, anything else, you as oil tycoon have the ability to mobilize state power to defend you and your interests and your power in a way that, nobody else does. And so those inequalities are locked into place increasingly. And I mean, there's a degree to which that was always true. I mean, like, the fruit companies were able to get the U.S. to invade various Latin American countries back in the day. But it has become worse. And it would be something that would become much better if we did sortition.
Yeah, so in the same way that this system of campaigning, which, you have to have funds for your campaign, sort of reinforces these hierarchies. It feeds them this constant inflow of economic power and political power, which can convert between each other pretty freely. Sortition would basically starve that system. It would cut off the food source.
Yeah. I guess this is what you alluded to there, which I forgot to mention, is you both have sort of politicians being bribed by the promise of going into lobbying, but there's also the much more immediate bribes, which is the campaign donations, which you need to take if you want to be reelected. You cannot say no to those bribes. You can say no to one or two of those bribes, but you can't say no to all of those. Otherwise, you're out of a job, because they'll give that money to your opponent instead. And sortition would end that. There's not much more to say on that. It wouldn't work.
Possible.
Yeah. Hiring people as lobbyists afterwards, you can just make that illegal in a sortition environment.
I bet that would get
passed.
That would get passed pretty quickly.
Yeah. Or it could be something that is like you have to go, you should go back to your previous career, or I don't know, there's some way to build things in so that there isn't that as a reward system. But the election finance thing is most of where the corruption is currently. It's most of the bribes now, and this would just end that. And it would end for people to stay in power, they have to take bribes system, which is what we currently have, which is not a good way to have a society.
Sortition ends that bribery system without requiring a much larger restructuring of the government and the policymaking process. And whether or not that would be a good idea, I'm not going to state my opinion on that right now. It would require a lot more work.
Yeah.
And sortition it changes a tiny part of that process. It changes how we select the officials who get into those positions.
Yeah.
And that's enough. That's enough to change
Everything.
a larger, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's awesome. It sort of feels like we found the weakness in the Death Star or whatever. Like, it's like the one this one tiny hack that Berkeley moms have been trying that doctors don't want you to hear about. Like you don't, it's a way to completely change the rules of the game, a way to make lots of problems fixable that currently aren't, with one small change that's actually really popular.
And really feasible.
Like, this doesn't require any real work, like, by people. Like, all we have to do is just change one set of rules. And again, there's been polling done now about this, about people's reaction to the idea of sortition. And what you have is you've got over 2/3 of people being on board the moment they hear about it.
Wow.
And only about 10% of people being, like, strongly against.
And that's before it's, like, thoroughly explained to them.
Yeah. This is, like, just the introduction. This cuts across political parties. That's the other thing that's wild about this, is it's about 2/3 of Republicans and 2/3 of Democrats are on board.
Really?
It's not like, you know, with all of, like, so many of these things you see in poll things, it's like 100% of Democrats and 3% of Republicans.
Uh-huh.
or like 70% of Democrats and 40% of Republicans.
It's almost like those are just bullshit categories.
Yeah, almost. And so that is incredibly exciting because it means that there is broad-based support in a way that, like, politicians can't necessarily ignore. The only way for them to really, you know, successfully head this off at the pass would be to make this a wedge issue and make this be one side is into it and one side isn't. But if you have the Democrats and Republican voters being like, we're going to vote you out of office because there's 60% of us in both parties, we're going to vote you out of office if you're not into this shit, this will get done really quickly. Like, it's not implausible to imagine a constitutional amendment getting passed within the next 10 to 15 years.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, that will require a lot of work and a lot of effort. But this is a solution that, like, could get done in the foreseeable future, which would make me very happy, and I think make everything better.
It would make at least 2/3 of us very happy, and probably more once we see the results of it. And that's a larger margin than we see on most of our elections.
Yeah. So I'm good with that.
Yeah. So I do want to touch a little bit on if there are any potential downsides or shortcomings of this approach. I think it's important to state that overall the benefits outweigh the potential costs or downsides, but, you know, for the sake of being balanced, are there any limitations with this that you see?
Yeah. So there's two main ones that, at the very least, I'm concerned with. The first major limitation is that this is very good at selecting large groups of people, large representative bodies, but the smaller the group, the less effective this is as a means of selecting them. This is not a good way to pick a president. If it's just like, every American, put your name in the hat, we're gonna pick one of y'all, you know, maybe that would be better than our current system. I've heard people say that, like, you know, they would rather have just taken random people than the last handful of presidents. We might have had better results. I don't think I'm comfortable saying that.
That's a lot to bet on.
Yeah. So that's limitation number one, is it's bad at selecting, like, specific people. Number two is there has been a fair amount of debate within the community of people who are into this between whether you should sort of whether participation should be mandatory or not, whether there should be the self-selection at all. There's sort of back and forth about like what are the impacts of each of these options. And my honest answer is I don't really care. I think both options would be better than what we have right now. I think I lean towards the self-select, like people should have to raise their hands. I think sending like the downsides of sending people to Congress who don't want to go to Congress are larger than the downsides of only sending people to Congress who want to go to Congress. Especially since we have these mathematical tools to sort of balance like the self-selection bias.
Right. So even if we implement a method for making sure no demographic is overrepresented in our political body compared to the general public, there could be issues with only sending people to Congress who want to be there. I think the concern here is of a sort of paternalism or elitism, that the Congress members might presume to know better than, and thus not listen to, the people that they're supposed to represent. And then the flip side of this, mandatory participation, could mean our representatives don't have the skills, interest, or the enthusiasm necessary to do the work of a congressperson. As well as being actually representative of the people, we'd also like our representatives to be dedicated and capable. But actually, our current electoral system may not do a great job of this. The election process assumes that the way candidates present themselves in their campaigns is indicative of how they'll do at the actual job. But how much do campaigning skills transfer to the sorts of work congresspeople do once they're actually in office? Smaller scale experiments with sortition, like in student governments, have found that popular, outspoken students don't always make the best representatives. And sometimes the person you'd least expect turns out to be the best leader, or the hardest worker. In short, voters may not be good at predicting which candidates will be strong leaders. We wind up electing charismatic individuals who ace their campaign strategy and public image, and who may very well turn out to be incompetent, impulsive, or disconnected once in office. But, of course, bad leaders are an issue for any method of selecting them.
There's sort of one other issue, which is, what if the person who's selected to represent your congressional district happens to be a total freaking maniac? Or just really weird and unpleasant and makes everybody uncomfortable?
That already happens.
I mean, it does. But, like, again, it would be nice if that was something we could stop.
Yeah.
One way to deal with this issue is to give people an option of throwing their congressional person out. If enough of them agree that that's a good idea. And I think for things like this, it's important to have that threshold be high. Like at least 60%, probably at least 2/3, maybe as high as 80%. Because you don't want a community with minority populations by whatever measure somebody is the minority. In some communities, cis, straight white guy is a minority. And if that person gets selected, as long as, there is some presence of that person in the community, or most people in the community aren't like, fuck that guy can still go to Congress because we want to represent the people who are really out there. Mm-hmm. But, if 80% of the people in a district are like, oh no, I don't want to send that person. They freak me out. Again, for whatever reasons, I think it's important to give people the option of doing that. And that's a good way of both sort of two birds with one stone. One, it gives you an option of getting rid of people, and it also brings back some of the legitimacy of our current government, which comes from, at least hypothetically, the place of the consent of the governed. We choose our leaders. And this gives sort of both, the benefits of randomness with the legitimacy and functional upsides of people, being part of the process of choosing their leaders.
That to me seems like a big question is, it's one thing if you poll people and they're in favor in theory, but if this suddenly happens, are people going to trust it? Are they going to feel like this was the right choice? Getting the public opinion, imagination,
Yeah.
cultural vibe.
Yeah.
It's a small thing compared to restructuring the entire government, but it's even a major lifestyle change for the individual experience of government. Like, no longer will I fill out my ballot with the list of all the candidates that I've just researched.
Yeah.
Or haven't researched. Maybe I just saw an ad on Facebook. That's kind of a big part of our culture, at least those of us who vote.
And a big part of like our identity as Americans.
Right. And even if you don't vote, you either have a strong opinion for why you don't that's based in your politics, or you're still like immersed in this culture of American politics, which is the voting and the campaigning.
Yeah. So there's a handful of answers to that. One is we already use sortition as a piece of our government system. We use it for juries. And we treat that as legitimate. We think that choosing people at random, a group of people, to deliberate and converse and decide is a good way of, determining the fates of people. And that is legitimate and is more legitimate than if we were electing people to determine those people's fates. So there's at least one sort of like easily accessible metaphor for everybody. There's also the legitimacy of this is how real democracies work. There's sort of two directions that you can go in when talking about the founders and sortition. It might be that the smarter move is to be like, the founders would have supported sortition because it like got rid of political parties and had other things. But the truth is that they probably wouldn't have been into it because the founders didn't like democracy. This is a slightly controversial statement, but my understanding is all of the founders were terrified of democracy and wanted to do everything they could to not have this be one. They wanted to have, what they wanted was to create a republic. And in a lot of senses, that's what they did. An increasingly democratic republic, but the, democracy, rule of the demos, rule of the people, is not what we currently have and not what we ever have had. What we have is an elected oligarchy and an aristocracy, these rich and powerful and famous people who compete on television to rule us. We're not ruling ourselves. This is not a democracy. And occasionally you'll hear people say that. Like occasionally people will be like, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. When democracy advocates are trying to make for a more democratic world, trying to increase the power of the people. And so there's the legitimacy that comes from this being a true democracy in a way that our current thing isn't. Again, sort of looping back to the founders, nobody was calling themselves a Democrat, except for specifically Thomas Paine, maybe, until 30, 40 years in to the experiment. The closest you got were the Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. And they still weren't Democrats. They did not believe in democracy. They believed in a more a slightly more democratic republic than they currently had. And they were not very successful at making it such, until the first big sort of expansion of voting from white men with property to white men who don't need to have lots of property didn't get accomplished until Andrew Jackson quite a ways later. And he did, his political party, they were the Democrats, and they were explicitly running us trying to create a more democratic society. So there's the legitimacy that comes from this being an actual democracy, and the sort of the legitimacy of calls back to antiquity.
It's closer to the ideals.
Yeah.
If not the historical reality of our founding, the ideals of our founding.
Yeah, much closer to the ideals of our founding. Of the people, by the people, for the people. Not of the millionaire Ivy League educated lawyers, for the millionaire Ivy League educated lawyers, by the millionaire Ivy League educated lawyers. Of, by, and for the people. We currently don't have any truck drivers in Congress. There should be.
That's a great slogan right there.
Like, if it's supposed to be of the people, then there's a hell of a lot of truck drivers. There should be some in Congress. I guess one more common argument against this is we should have Congress should be full of the best and brightest in America. And I think that's our current system is terrible at that. Our current system is selecting megalomaniacal, unempathetic people who are very good at, like, getting money and saying good things on TV. We are not getting the best and brightest, and certainly not the kindest, most reasonable or effective problem solvers. Like, what we are getting, we are currently not getting that.
The campaigning system does not select for intelligence.
No.
And it's dubious, the correlation between how someone presents themselves in their campaign and what they'll actually be like as a leader.
Totally. Like, we're very, very bad at actually, like, selecting people who are good at their job or who are going to do what we want. Like, the current system is terrible at this anyway. So, but the other thing is, what we're selecting for a place like Congress is we're selecting representatives. We're not selecting leaders. And what makes a good representative is somebody who represents you, who can serve as sort of a stand-in for you or people like you in conversations and debates about what we want the country to look like. And they don't need to have legal training. Lots of congressional people currently don't. Like, that, they have legislative aids for that. They don't have to be experts in, like, medicine or finance or anything else. They have expert witnesses for that. Their job is to be there to represent us. And if that's the job, and it's literally the job title, they're doing a really bad job.
Failed step one.
Failed step one. Yeah.
Well, I, for one, would prefer a government where we can at least accomplish step one. And after talking with Matthew, I think sortition offers a lot of other advantages too. So the last thing we had to talk about, of course, is how we can actually get to work on implementing sortition, and, in so doing, come to realize its benefits.
If you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of resources out there. A quick Google of sortition will give you a little bit of a go to Wikipedia. There's actually a significant page on this. You can get some of the historical background, a little bit of the arguments or conversations that have happened around this. There's been several books written. There's several little articles and pamphlets that have gone around. There's a fantastic podcast episode that I think does a much better job of selling this and certainly tells a better story about this than I have. It's called The Powerball Revolution. It's an episode of Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast, and it's excellent. And talks about the ways that this is being carried out today for student government, and really getting into the ways in which this is just an infinitely better system for selecting representatives and selecting leaders than what we currently have. If you're interested in getting involved, there's an organization whose newsletter I follow called Join of by Four. If you listen to that podcast episode, there's a guy on there, Adam Cronkrite, who has been running these for a while, and that he's currently got the organization of by Four set up to push for the constitutional amendment. But they're working on several different projects that are fairly exciting. But honestly, the thing that I would recommend most is talk to friends and family about this. See what their reactions are. Start, on the local level immediately around you, building awareness of this as a thing, and be excited about it. It's really, really cool and potentially transformative of the ways that humans interact with each other and organize themselves. And it seems like a lot of the time in our world right now, we're getting fed a sort of an endless news stream of terrible, awful things that are happening. And I feel like often it's pretty easy to get into a place of, all of these terrible things, we're all gonna die. This is something that provides hope on almost all of those fronts. Because most of the things blocking us from dealing with the big problems facing us, a lot of them are the structure of our politics. And if we restructure our politics, we can potentially meet these issues and do some really, really awesome stuff. And hopefully at some point this becomes a genuine mass movement, and then you can set up some local chapter of your sortitionist society with you and your friends who you've talked to about this, and y'all can link up with the other groups that are organizing, hopefully across the country. So that's how to get involved and make shit happen.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Woo! Oh, I'm so sorry. The last thing that I would really recommend doing is seeing if there's any local organizations or organizations you're involved with who might be interested in doing this for their local governance and administration. One good example of this would be if you are a student at a high school, middle school, or college. See about if the student government at your school or college could become based on sortition. If you're part of a activist group or nonprofit group, see if there's any openness to having leadership positions be filled this way as well. I've had friends who have been part of activist groups where, somebody charismatic shows up, takes over, and runs away with the money. This is a good hedge against that. So, yeah, see if there's ways for you to actually incorporate this as practice into your life and work.
Yeah, totally. So, one last question as we're wrapping things up here. What does utopia look like for you?
Well, I mean, what's funny here is I feel like I'm required. I should answer this question in the spirit of what I've been talking about. So in that spirit, utopia looks like a society in which everyone's views and personality and desires are represented in the course that the society takes. A society that's reflective of the beliefs and needs and wants of the many and the everyone, as opposed to a tiny fraction of society who has managed to monopolize both financial and increasingly state power.
Left to themselves, people grow their hair. Left to themselves, they take off their shoes. Left to themselves, they make love, sleep easily, share blankets, dope, and children. They are not lazy or afraid. They plant seeds, they smile, they speak to one another. The word coming into its own, touch of love on the brain, the ear. We return with the sea, the tides. We return as often as leaves, as numerous as grass, gentle, insistent. We remember the way. Our babes toddle barefoot through the cities of the universe. Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. My guest today was Matthew Gray. The closing poem was Revolutionary Letter No. 4 by Deanne DePrima. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud. You can follow the show on Twitter at SolarpunkCast or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. If you like what you hear and want to help support my project, please share the podcast with your friends and followers. Let me know if you'd be interested in donating or becoming a recurring supporter, and if you or someone you know needs written transcriptions of episodes, please let me know there's a need for that. Finally, remember the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future that you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big and keep up the good work.